Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Poetry Thursday, where some booktubers read you a poem on Thursday. I'm one of them. I'm reading my way through this big anthology, 20th Century American Poetry. And I've mentioned before, this is an anthology that has 3 editors. And when that happens, you're going to have 3 different artistic provenances, 3 different editors, 3 different ideas about what belongs in such a book and what doesn't, what's representative and what isn't, what's the greatest and what isn't. And that's what will change one anthology from one to another, depending on who's at the editorial helm. But another thing that will creep in with books like this is individual favorites from one author, from one of the editors, or weird little oddities that the editors more or less agree belong in a book like this. Usually, it's been my experience that those things do not belong in a book like this, but they end up here anyway. And that's what we're dealing with today. We're dealing with a poet named Richard Eberhart, who had a brief reputation as a poet's poet. He's not known. He's not remembered. He shouldn't be in this anthology. He's only represented here by one poem. The one poem that he's represented by happened to gain some fame, some notoriety. So we'll read that poem. Before we move on anywhere else, we will read that poem. So this will be a short Poetry Thursday. It'll be just the one poem and a footnote of a poet who doesn't deserve your attention. The poem is called The Fury of Aerial Bombardment, and it was written in 1945 or 47. You would think the fury of aerial bombardment would rouse God to relent. The infinite spaces are still silent. He looks on shock-pride faces. History even does not know what is meant. You would feel that after so many centuries, God would give man to repent. Yet he can kill as Cain could, but with multitudinous will, no farther advanced than in his ancient furies. That stanza fails in a couple of ways, right? Multitudinous and century, or furies and centuries, doesn't work. And no poem should ever have the word multitudinous in it. That is not an English. It's an English word that no one uses. Poets, most especially, should never use such a thing. Was man made stupid to see his own stupidity? Is God, by definition, indifferent beyond us all? Is the eternal truth man's fighting soul, wherein the beast ravens in its own avidity? Let's move on. Of Van Wettering I speak, and Averill, names on a list whose faces I do not recall. But they are gone to early death, who late in school distinguished the belt feed lever from the belt-holding pawl. P-A-W-L. You'd have to Google that. Of course, in 1947 there was no Google. You would still have to look it up. So another failing. Any poem that makes you scurry to a work of reference has failed. Especially since you won't care otherwise. The poem has not moved you at all. If it did, then the poet could throw in as many obscure words as he wants, and you still wouldn't care. You certainly wouldn't rush off right away. Instead, you would be moved. This poem doesn't move. This poem is largely dumb. It consists almost entirely of the poet, or the narrator of the poem, archly asking all sorts of dumb questions about God. Does God think this? Does God consider it this way? All very cheap. It's all very cheap. It's all very easy, and the rhyme scheme that I'm sure you could hear is very obvious, but it's not done very well. If you're going to use a rhyme scheme that involves end rhymes, you've got to have a better ear than this. The end rhymes throughout this are mostly bad. And I'm sure that the black turtleneck wearing Cantab lounge crowd would say they're meant to be bad, man. You in favor of war? Anyway, that is Richard Eberhart. We're gonna now that we've encountered him, we're gonna try and forget that we ever did. But we'll be back. We'll be back next week with a longer Poetry Thursday, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.